The pistols were always warm. That was the first thing you noticed. Not the smell, though the smell was everywhere. Thick, inescapable, a compound of blood and antiseptic, and the sour heat of 600 human bodies packed into stone corridors built for 60. Not the sounds, though the sounds never stopped. A low, continuous moaning that after 2 weeks you simply absorbed, the way a man absorbs rain after long enough in it, the way it becomes the texture of the world rather than an event within it. The first thing every night was the warmth. You reached into the dark beside a stretcher, and your hand closed around steel that should have been cold. Stone walls, February air seeping through the rock, a Hungarian winter pressing down on everything above, and instead you felt heat, the specific heat of a thing that has been held by a human hand for hours, sometimes all day. That was what told you everything. Not the face of the man on the stretcher, not his eyes, which were often closed or open and seeing nothing you could identify. The warmth of the steel in your hand, the fact that he had been holding it, the fact that he had not yet used it. Those were yours to take. My name is Carl Brenner. In another life, a life that had ended so recently I could still touch its edges if I reached carefully, I taught mathematics and basic reading to children between the ages of 6 and 10 in a schoolhouse on Lindenstrasse in Leipzig. I was 26 years old. I had a wife named Marta who made coffee too strong and left books open face down on every surface in our apartment, which was a habit that had once annoyed me and which I would have given anything by February of 1945 to witness one more time. I was not a soldier in any meaningful sense. I had been trained as one, processed through the machinery of it, given a uniform and a rifle, and the technical knowledge of how to operate both. But something in me had never completed the transformation. I observed. I recorded. I moved through the war the way a man moves through a building that is burning around him, with great care, with acute attention, and with the persistent, bewildering sense that he does not quite belong in the situation he finds himself in. This is the account of one night, February the 11th, 1945, into the morning of February the 12th. What I saw, what I did, what I failed to do, which is perhaps the more important category. But to understand that night, you have to understand the tunnels first. Castle Hill rises from the western bank of the Danube like a clenched fist. The old city of Buda sits on top of it, or sat by February, palaces and churches and cobblestone streets that had survived for centuries. Beneath it, carved into the limestone over those same centuries, ran a system of caves and passages that no one had fully mapped. The hill was more hollow than solid. You could feel that sometimes lying in the tunnels at night, listening to the shelling overhead, the sense that the rock around you was thinner than it looked, that the hill was mostly air. They had built a proper hospital down there in the 1930s. 60 beds, X-ray equipment, generators, and tiled floors and electric lights, and the whole infrastructure of modern medicine installed in chambers that had previously held wine barrels and, in earlier centuries, things best not thought about. It had been a reasonable facility for its time, a sensible precaution against a war that, in the 1930s, was still hypothetical. By February of 1945, there were 600 patients inside it, possibly more. The count was never reliable. Men arrived continuously from the surface positions, carried down the entrance shafts on stretchers, dragged by whoever could still drag, sometimes crawling on their own with wounds that should have prevented any movement at all. The original 60 beds had been pushed together so that 2 could occupy the space of 1. The corridors were lined with stretchers laid end to end, and between the stretchers, men lay directly on the stone floor on whatever could be found to put beneath them. The tiled chamber floors had long since been covered over. Dr. Heinz Brandt ran the place. I use the word ran loosely. What Brandt did was hold it together by force of habit and the refusal to acknowledge, in any outward way, that what he was doing bore no resemblance to medicine. He was 53 years old, which in those tunnels felt ancient. He had been a surgeon in Frankfurt before the war, a good one by all accounts, the kind of doctor who attracted patients from other cities. He had come to Budapest as part of the garrison medical establishment in 1944 and had simply never left, the way many people in Budapest had simply never left. the window for leaving having closed around them while they were attending to other things. He was the one who gave the order about the pistols. He had not explained it when he gave it. He simply appeared in the doorway of the section I worked in. I had been assigned to assist with basic patient care when it became clear that my other functions were not urgently required, and said quietly to go through the wards each night after dark and collect them. I had understood immediately. The understanding required no elaboration. You went down the corridors with a canvas sack, and you found them, on the stretchers, on the floor beside the stretchers, in hands that had been gripping them so long the fingers did not release easily. Some of the men had already used them. Those you left alone. The ones who hadn't yet, those were yours. It became my task. I don't know precisely why it fell to me, rather than someone else. If Brandt had asked me once, and I had done it, and after that no one asked again. It simply became understood that this was what I did, each night after the electric lights were dimmed, walking the corridors with the sack, feeling the warmth. I had been doing it for 14 nights when I found Otto Fischer's pistol. Otto was in the ward 3 sections down from the main entrance, in what had originally been a storage chamber and now held 22 men on 12 stretchers. He had been there for 9 days, the result of a Soviet mortar round that had landed close enough to throw him against a wall with sufficient force to crack 2 ribs and tear something in his left shoulder that the doctors had addressed as best they could with the materials available, which were not equal to the addressing. He was not, Omri by the standards of that hospital, seriously wounded. He could sit up. He could, with effort and visible pain, stand. He ate what was given to him, which by that point was almost nothing, without complaint. He was 28 years old and had the specific kind of physical resilience that belongs to men who grew up doing hard physical work. He had been a carpenter before the war from a small town in Bavaria, and there was something in him that was simply built more solidly than most. I had known him since the spring of 1944. We had arrived in Budapest within a week of each other as part of the same reinforcement deployment, been billeted in the same building in the Pest district before the Soviets crossed the Danube, and had found ourselves through no particular plan on either side, simply always in proximity. He laughed easily, in which by the autumn of 1944 was becoming an increasingly rare quality. He had an inexhaustible supply of observations about the gap between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked, delivered in a dry Bavarian inflection that I had found irritating for approximately the first 2 weeks and had depended on entirely ever since. He was the person in that hospital that I would have described as a friend. In the restricted vocabulary that the situation permitted, stripped of everything that the word usually implies about time and shared experience and future plans, he was the closest thing to it. I found his pistol on the 14th night. The ward was dark except for a single lamp at the far end. Most of the men were asleep or in the condition that resembled sleep closely enough to leave undisturbed. I moved along the stretchers with the sack, doing what I did, and I reached the stretcher where Otto lay and I found it. It was lying on his chest. His right hand was resting over it, not gripping it, not pointed anywhere, simply present. The barrel was pointed toward his chin at an angle that could have been accidental and was not. The steel was warm. I stood there for a moment that I cannot give a duration to. He was looking at the ceiling. His breathing was regular. He was not asleep. I reached down and took the pistol. His hand released it without resistance, which was different from most of the others. Most of the others, you had to work slightly. His hand simply opened, as though he had been waiting for someone to come and take it. As though, perhaps, well, that was the specific calculation he had arrived at, to hold it long enough for someone to find it, and to stop holding it then. I put it in the sack. I stood up. He was still looking at the ceiling. I moved on to the next stretcher. I did not say anything. Neither did he. There was an entire conversation inside that silence, and we had it, and it was finished, and I walked on. That was the 14th night. To understand what was happening in those tunnels, you have to understand something about the city above them and the decisions, or the single specific decision that had led to where we were. Budapest fell under siege on December 26, 1944, when Soviet forces completed the encirclement of the city. 2 army groups closed the ring. Inside it, approximately 70,000 Axis troops, a significant Hungarian force, less than somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million civilians who had nowhere to go when the ring closed around them. From the beginning, the military situation was readable to anyone willing to read it. The city was surrounded. The supply situation was critical. The Soviet forces outside the ring substantially outnumbered the forces inside it, and the Soviets had the momentum of an army that had been advancing continuously for months and had no particular reason to stop. The rational military response, evaluated purely on the terms that military decisions are supposed to be evaluated on, was negotiation of surrender. This was not a controversial analysis among the officers in Budapest who were in a position to make it. The city could not be held indefinitely. The relief operation being planned would face enormous obstacles. And every week of continued resistance would cost lives. German lives, Hungarian lives, Soviet lives, civilian lives, that could not be recovered. The order from Hitler was explicit. Budapest was a Festung, a fortress city. It would be held at all costs. No withdrawal, no surrender. The garrison would fight where it stood until relieved. 3 relief operations were launched to break through the Soviet ring. Conrad I, Conrad II, Conrad III. Each one was mounted with real forces, real commitment, real hope on the part of the men inside the pocket, who could hear the distant guns and believe, for days at a time, that rescue was coming. Conrad I came within 25 kilometers of the city before being driven back. Conrad III, the most serious of the attempts, he reached within 12 kilometers of the Budapest perimeter, close enough that the men in the tunnels heard the artillery and understood what it meant. Then it was driven back. Like the others, there was no Conrad IV. Dr. Brandt had told me about Bataan once, in a quiet moment in the tunnels when the shelling had paused, and there was nothing to do but exist inside the relative stillness. He had read about it in medical journals that had reached Budapest before the siege closed. The American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula in 1942, surrounded, running out of food and medicine, cut off from relief, holding a position that could not be held because the order from above was to hold it. The death march that followed when it finally fell. He said it without emphasis, not as a comparison, not as a lesson, just as a fact that had attached itself to something in his mind and refused to detach. He said, "Generals who give orders to hold at all costs are almost never the ones paying the cost." He said it, and then he went back to work. I thought about it often after that, in the tunnels listening to the ceiling shake. Ernst Vogel came back to the tunnels on the evening of February 11. He appeared at the entrance to my section at some point after dark, still in his greatcoat, snow from the surface positions melting off the shoulders and forming small dark patches on the stone floor. His face was gray in the lamplight, gray the way all faces were by then, the skin drawn tight over the architecture of the skull, the dark circles of sustained exhaustion around the eyes. But his eyes themselves were clear in the way that I had come to recognize as specific to him. He was approximately 40 years old. He had been a regular Army officer for most of his adult life, which meant he had developed a relationship with the gap between how things were supposed to go and how they went that was both deeper and differently calibrated than Otto's. Where Otto's response to that gap was a dry Bavarian irony, Vogel's was a kind of absolute attention. He watched everything. He said almost nothing. He did not comfort people, and he did not deceive them, which made him, in that hospital, both the least reassuring and the most trustworthy person present. He had been at Stalingrad. Everyone knew this. No one discussed it. In the way that no one discusses the most obvious and significant things in a situation where the most obvious and significant things are unbearable. He had gone into that pocket in November of 1942 as part of the 6th Army and had come out of it alive in February of 1943, one of the roughly 6,000 men who walked out of the cauldron before the final surrender. He had spent 2 years between that February and this one doing things that were not discussed, and then he had come to Budapest, and the ring had closed around him, and here he was in the tunnels looking at the wounded with those clear, careful eyes. He stood at the entrance of the section and spoke. He spoke quickly, quietly, with the flat, informational tone of a man who has decided to transmit facts without editorializing them. I caught most of it. Tonight, all remaining forces. Sorting a breakout, northwest, through the Buda Hills toward the German lines. 28,000 men, or however many could still move. I asked what that meant for the ones who couldn't move. He looked at me for a moment. It was not a cruel look. It was the look of a man who does not waste energy being sorry for things that cannot be altered by being sorry for them. He said, "Tonight." Then he turned and went back up toward wherever he had come from. I stood in the tunnel with the sack in my hand, 8 pistols in it. I set it down on the floor. Around me, the word was moving through the tunnels the way everything moved in that place. Not through announcement, not through official channels, but person to person, whispered, passed sideways, received and then passed on. Within 15 minutes, everyone in the tunnels who could stand was standing, checking weapons, pulling on coats, strapping on packs, moving with the mechanical efficiency of men who have no decision left to make, whose only remaining task is the physical one of movement. The ones on the stretchers knew too. The word had reached them as well. I do not know exactly how. It moved the way all information moved down there, through the rock itself, seemingly, through the shared atmosphere of 600 people breathing the same closed air. They knew. I could see it in the ones who were conscious, in the specific quality of their stillness as the mobile men prepared around them. Not the stillness of sleep or medication or shock. The stillness of people who understand exactly what is happening and have arrived, each in their own way, when at whatever they're going to do about it. I walked to where my kit was kept, a pack, a rifle, a greatcoat with the elbows worn through, holes that I had been meaning to address since November. I began to prepare. I did not look at the men on the stretchers, not because I didn't want to. Looking would have made it real in a way that I could not afford, not yet, not while there were still things that had to be done. So I looked at my hands instead, working the straps of the pack, checking the rifle, pulling on the greatcoat that was not warm enough and would have to be warm enough anyway. I focused on the objects, the physical tasks, the next 5 minutes, then the 5 minutes after that. Before I left, I went to Otto's ward. He was sitting up on his stretcher. He had found his coat somewhere. It was draped over his shoulders. Show me the collar turned up. His ribs were bound under his shirt, which made the coat sit awkwardly. His left arm was in a sling fashioned from a strip of bandaging. He was pale in the lamplight, and the dark circles under his eyes had deepened in 9 days of barely adequate food and inadequate sleep. But he was sitting up, and his eyes were alert in the way his eyes were usually alert, taking everything in, processing it at some speed that did not necessarily result in visible action. He looked at me when I came in. I said we were going. He said he had heard. I said his ribs. I said the shoulder. He said he had walked on worse. He said this as a statement of fact, not as bravado, which was characteristic. Otto's courage, such as it was, had never been the performed kind. It was simply the quiet insistence on continuing to function, which is in some ways the more durable variety. I helped him to his feet. The ribs caught him on the way up. I saw it in his face, a brief compression of expression that he controlled almost immediately. He took his pack from beside the stretcher, the one that had been sitting ready for days, and settled it carefully over the good shoulder. He checked the rifle. He nodded. We walked toward the tunnel entrance. At the door, I stopped. I turned back. The ward behind us. 22 men on 12 stretchers. Some of them were watching us leave. Some were not. The single lamp at the far end threw a yellow light that didn't reach the far corners. The moaning that I had stopped hearing weeks ago was audible again now. Suddenly, the way a sound becomes audible again when you are about to leave the place it comes from. I looked at the sack on the floor. 8 pistols in it. By morning, Brandt's people would redistribute them, I thought. Put them back where they belonged, in the hands that needed them. I did not look at the men. I turned and walked out of the tunnel into the cold. The night air hit like a wall. After 2 weeks in the enclosed warmth of 600 bodies, the suffocating, unventilated heat of human beings packed into stone chambers, the air thick and damp and tasting of things better not identified. The outside was a physical shock. The temperature was well below freezing. The cold entered the chest the moment you breathed, made the inside of the nose burn with each inhale, turned the moisture in the eyes to a film of ice within seconds of exposure. My greatcoat was not enough. Nobody's was. The fog was dense, thick enough that you could not see more than 20 meters in any direction, which was, I remember thinking, the only fortunate circumstance in the entire situation. The city around Castle Hill was dark. No electricity had worked for weeks. No lights anywhere. Only the fog and the darkness, and far to the south, the occasional distant flash of Soviet artillery illuminating the low clouds from underneath. Brief orange-white pulses in the murk, like something breathing. We moved out through the narrow streets that descend from the hill. Old streets, medieval streets, stone buildings on either side that had been standing since before anyone alive could remember, and that were now, most of them, in various states of ruin. Facades collapsed into the roadway. Interiors exposed to the sky through holes that shells had punched through the upper floors. The debris from weeks of bombardment piled against the bases of walls, overflowing into the streets. We filed out in a long column, not a formation, nothing organized enough to deserve that word. Just men in gray coats, rifles held close to the body, boots on the ice. Hundreds, then thousands, the column stretching back behind me, further than the fog would let me see. It was then that I noticed the others, not soldiers. A woman pulling a child by the hand, the child moving with the mechanical compliance of a small person who has been crying for so long they have used up the energy of it and are now simply moving because the adult is moving. An old man alone carrying one bag, keeping pace with the soldiers around him with the focused concentration of someone who understands that maintaining pace is the only task that matters. A family, a man and a woman and two older children, a boy and a girl, maybe 12 and 14. The man pushing something in front of him through the dark. I needed a moment to understand what it was. A pram, a baby carriage, its wheels turning on the ice. They were everywhere, mixed into the column, indistinguishable in the fog and darkness, except by size and shape. Thousands of them. People who had been living in cellars for weeks, in basements, in the hospital tunnels, in whatever cavity in the destroyed city had offered minimal protection. People who had no surrender that was available to them, no status that would guarantee treatment, on no option except to walk into the dark with the soldiers and hope that whatever waited at the end of it was better than what they were leaving. Otto was walking beside me, his good arm slightly forward for balance on the ice. He looked at the pram. He said nothing. Neither did I. The column moved. We moved with it, into the fog, into the dark, toward the edge of the city and whatever waited beyond it. The pistols had been warm. Now they were back in the ward, in the hands that had held them all day. And I was out here on the ice in the February dark. And the 600 were behind me in the tunnels. And the city was a ruin in every direction. And ahead of us were hills and Soviet-controlled territory, and the long odds of mathematics that a former schoolteacher from Leipzig should have been better equipped to calculate than he was. But mathematics, I had learned by then, is only useful when the numbers are the kind that can be acted upon. These were not. So you move forward. That was the only instruction that mattered. The city was a ruin. That was not new information. It had been a ruin for weeks, long before the breakout. Long before the pocket had closed around us and the word Festung had been applied to it like a seal on a document that no one inside the document had been consulted about. But at night, moving through it on foot, you understood the scale of it differently than you did from the tunnels or from the fixed positions on the hill. In the tunnels, the destruction was abstract. A vibration in the rock, a tremor in the ceiling, the sound of the world coming apart filtered through meters of solid limestone until it became almost theoretical. From the positions, you saw your sector, your field of fire, the specific patch of ruined street that was your professional responsibility. Moving through it, you felt it. The streets we passed through had been streets once. Cobblestones, buildings on either side, lampposts that had not given light in weeks. Now they were channels cut through walls of debris, facades that had come down and filled the roadway to waist height in places, to chest height in others. Holes where shells had punched through the surface into basements below. Dark openings in the frozen ground that you had to step around or fall into. Everything coated in a thin layer of snow, that the fog kept invisible until your boot found it and the ice beneath gave way and your weight shifted dangerously. The column moved in near silence. Or that was the thing that surprised me most. 28,000 people, soldiers and civilians together, a number that should have produced continuous noise, the shuffling and coughing and murmured conversation of a mass of human beings in motion, and almost nothing. Boots on ice, the occasional scrape of a rifle barrel against a wall. The baby carriage somewhere behind me, its wheels making a small rhythmic sound on the cobblestones that I tracked for a while, and then lost in the fog. The silence was not organized. No one had ordered it. It came from something more fundamental. The collective understanding of people who know that the dark is full of things listening for them and who have adjusted their behavior accordingly, without discussion. The way animals adjust. Otto walked beside me. His breathing was controlled. I could hear him managing it, taking the shallow breaths that didn't pull at the bound ribs, exhaling carefully. He had said nothing since we left the hill. This was unusual for Otto, whose silence in ordinary circumstances lasted about as long as it took him to think of something to say about whatever was in front of him, which was never long. The silence told me something about what the ribs and the shoulder were costing him that he had chosen not to say directly. The column had broken into smaller groups within the first 10 minutes, each group moving through a different street, all converging on the same route out of the city. In our group, perhaps 300 men, enough to fill a street from one end to the other, not enough to fight a determined Soviet position. We didn't know where the Soviet positions were. That was the truth of it, and it was worse than knowing. The intelligence that had reached us in those final days had been confused and contradictory in the way that intelligence becomes when the apparatus generating it is disintegrating. They were everywhere. They were concentrated to the south. They had positions around Selkalman Square. They didn't have positions around Selkalman Square. The radio had been dead for 2 days. Nobody knew anything with confidence. You moved blind through a destroyed city with Soviet forces somewhere in the dark around you, and you moved because stopping meant dying, and forward was the only direction that made any sense. The first 20 minutes were almost peaceful. The artillery had stopped. Oh, after weeks of near-continuous bombardment, the rhythm of it so embedded in the body that you had stopped registering individual salvos and simply lived inside the permanent low-level alertness it produced, the guns had gone silent. The only sounds were the column itself and somewhere far to the south, the occasional single crack of a rifle. Individual shots, spaced far apart. Sniper fire, probably, or sentries. Not volleys, not coordinated. The Soviets were there somewhere in the darkness, but they weren't attacking. The silence felt wrong. After weeks of noise, silence had become the more alarming condition. Silence meant something had changed and you didn't yet know what. But there was nothing to do about it except keep moving, so we kept moving. Someone in the column passed back an estimate of the German soldiers in the breakout. The number moved through the group the way everything moved in the dark. Person to person, whispered, half heard, repeated until it reached me. 17,000. 17,000 German soldiers, most of them starving, many of them wounded, trying to reach lines that were roughly 40 kilometers away through territory the Soviets controlled entirely. I held the number in my head as we moved. 17,000. It sounded like a large number. It wasn't. Not against what was out there. We came to Vermezzo. Before the siege, it had been an ordinary city park, a flat open space between Castle Hill and the western districts, with benches and paths and trees that people had walked under on Sunday afternoons. During the siege, the German command had used it as a landing zone for supply gliders, the last of which had come in 3 weeks before this night, before the Soviets closed even that option. They had shelled it constantly after that, turning it from grass to churned mud to frozen earth. Now it was a flat white expanse of snow, completely open, no cover for 200 meters in any direction. We couldn't cross it as a column, too exposed, so we broke into groups of 50 and ran. The first group went, 50 men sprinting across the frozen ground, boots throwing up sprays of packed snow, the sound of them loud in the silence. They ran hunched over, rifles held tight to the body, moving as fast as exhausted men in greatcoats can move on a surface of ice. 30 seconds, 40. They reached the far edge and disappeared into the fog. Hey, nothing happened. No gunfire, no flares, no response. The second group went, then the third, then the fourth. Each time the same, 50 men running, the sound of their boots, the spray of snow, and then silence on the other side. Each time, nothing. By the time my group crossed, I was in the seventh or eighth wave. I had lost count. I had almost begun to believe in it. Not hope, something colder than hope. The mechanical calculation that says, they haven't seen us yet. We might get through. Arithmetic, not optimism. I ran with the others. The snow was harder than it looked, packed tight by the frost, slippery under the boots. I stumbled twice, caught myself, kept moving. Halfway across, my lungs were burning from the cold air. The fog swallowed the far side. I ran toward it blind, trusting it was there. It was. And we reformed on the other side in the shadow of a row of ruined buildings. The men around me were breathing hard, faces drawn from the cold and the exertion. Some bent double with their hands on their knees. Nobody stopped for long. The column reformed and kept moving. Otto had crossed in the same wave as me. I had watched him run, the good arm slightly extended for balance, the coat flapping, his body automatically compensating for the bound ribs, with a slight forward lean that changed his gait in a way I had not seen before. He reached the far side and I heard the breath go out of him when he slowed, a controlled exhale that was also a suppression of something more than effort. He did not bend double. He stood straight and waited for the group to move again. He caught me looking. He said, "Don't." I didn't. When the streets on the far side of Vermezzo were narrower, older, the buildings less damaged than those near the hill. Some still had roofs. Some had walls standing on more than one side. The column moved faster here, the cover better, the confidence, if you could call it that, and you probably shouldn't, growing with every block we put between ourselves and the hill. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The artillery stayed silent. No flares, no movement from the Soviet positions that were supposed to be around Cell Kalman Square. Supposed to be, according to the last intelligence we'd had. Maybe they weren't there. Maybe they had pulled back to concentrate elsewhere. Maybe the fog had hidden us completely. We kept moving, the buildings thinned. And we were approaching the western edge of the city, the point where Budapest ended and open ground began. The streets became wider, less obstructed. The ground more even, covered in undisturbed snow. Ahead in the distance, the fog was slightly thinner. You could see further. 40 meters, 50. The last row of buildings and beyond them open ground, and then the dark line of the hills. The column moved into a small square, or what had been one, an open space between the last buildings before the city gave way to countryside. The men spread out, filling the space, moving quickly. 300 in my group alone, thousands more behind in other streets, all converging on this point. The fog thick enough to hide us from each other as much as from the Soviets. You moved forward and trusted that everyone else was doing the same. We were almost through. That thought moved through the group without anyone saying it, visible in the way the men moved slightly faster, slightly less carefully, the spacing between groups tightening as they converged. The mechanical arithmetic had shifted. We had crossed Vermezzo. We had moved through half the city without being fired upon. The hills were close. Then the first flare went up. It came from somewhere to the north. A single bright point rising from behind a row of buildings, climbing fast, trailing smoke. It hung at the apex of its arc for a moment. Then it burst. White light. The fog turned luminous. A wall of glowing white in every direction. For 5 seconds, everything within 200 meters was visible. Every man in the open square. Every civilian. Every face turned upward toward the light. One blinded by it after hours of total darkness. The faces were gray, gaunt, the skin drawn tight. The coats were dark with moisture and dirt. The rifles hung at their sides like dead weight. Then the light faded. Darkness again. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence of people who understand exactly what has just happened and are waiting for what comes next. The second flare went up 3 seconds later. Red. Not illumination. Signal. It rose from the east, from somewhere inside the city behind us. The third flare was green, from the south, 3 flares, 3 directions, 3 colors, coordinated. I understood before the first shell landed. They had been watching, not guessing, not reacting to the noise of the column or the movement on Vermezo. Watching. The positions around Cell Kalman Square had not been empty. Though and they had not pulled back. They had stayed, and they had waited, and they had counted. Each group of 50 crossing Vermezo, each 100 men moving through the streets, each cluster filing into the square. And when enough of us were concentrated in a single space, they had sent 3 flares in 3 directions, and the guns had opened. This was not a defense. It was a trap. It had been a trap from the beginning. The silence for 20 minutes, the uncontested crossing of Vermezo, the absence of patrols in the streets. None of it had been luck or fog or Soviet inattention. It had been deliberate. They had let us come, let us believe, let us fill the square. And now they knew exactly where we were. The first shell hit the ground 40 meters ahead. The explosion was nothing like artillery in the tunnels. In the tunnels, it was a distant thing, a vibration, a tremor in the rock, dust from the ceiling. Frightening, yes, but separated from you by meters of solid stone. Removed. Theoretical. This was not theoretical. The shell hit open ground at ground level, and the shock wave hit like a fist to the entire chest. The air itself compressed, a sudden pressure that knocked the breath out and pushed you backward before your mind had processed the sound. The ground shook. Debris flew outward in a circle. Earth, stone, fragments of frozen mud, pieces of things that had been standing a moment before and were not standing anymore, and came down on everyone within 30 meters. I was already flat before I knew I was moving, pressed into the snow, face in the cold white surface, hands over the back of my head, the instinct arriving before the decision. The second shell hit before the dust of the first had cleared, then a third. Then they merged, a sustained barrage, shells coming in from the north and the east simultaneously. The detonations so close together and so continuous that the individual explosions stopped being separate events and became a single unbroken roar. The ground shook constantly. The air was full of debris. I couldn't see anything. The explosions lit the fog from within, turning it into a disorienting, blinding white, and between the flashes, everything was absolute black. Then the rockets came. Katyushas, multiple launchers firing simultaneously, the sound of them unmistakable. A high tearing scream that cut through even the sustained roar of the artillery, a sound that seemed to tear the air itself along its path. They came in salvos, each one a burst of flame and shrapnel that tore through whatever was in its path. I heard them coming, and I pressed myself harder into the snow as though I could go through it, as though the frozen ground beneath would open and take me in, and the rockets hit somewhere to my left close enough that I felt the heat of the explosions through the greatcoat. The ground lifted and dropped and lifted again. People were falling. I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anything. But I heard them. Artillery has a sound when it hits a body. It is different from the sound of it hitting the ground. Flat and wet and very final. And then the screaming, from those it hadn't finished. Not all of them screamed. Some simply stopped making any sound at all, which was in its own way worse. The barrage went on. Time had stopped working in the way it usually works. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like seconds. Each moment was a separate event, a shell landing, the shock wave, the debris, the wait in the half-second silence before the next one. And in that half-second, everything came back with terrible clarity. The cold of the snow against the face, the ringing in the ears, the sound of men near and far screaming or moaning or breathing too fast, and then the next shell, and it was gone again. At some point, the barrage paused, not stopped. Paused. A gap of perhaps 10 seconds in which no shells landed. I lifted my head. The fog was thick with smoke now, the explosions having churned up earth and debris, and the smoke from fires mixing with the original fog until breathing required effort. Through it, I could see shapes, bodies on the ground, dozens of them, soldiers and civilians together, lying in the postures of people who had been in motion when they were hit. Some were still moving, crawling mostly, dragging themselves toward whatever cover existed. I got up. My legs held, which surprised me. Everything felt wrong. Shaken loose inside, rearranged. My ears were ringing so badly that the sounds around me arrived as if from underwater. But I could move, so I moved. I ran toward the nearest wall, the remains of a building with one wall still standing 3 meters high, and threw myself behind it and pressed my back against the stone. Others arrived. Out of the smoke and fog, in ones and twos. Soldiers mostly stumbling, some bleeding, all moving with the stunned mechanical gait of men who have just survived something that should have killed them. A man arrived clutching his right arm with his left hand, the blood running between his fingers and freezing almost instantly in the air, forming dark crystals on his skin. He sat down heavily and stared at his arm. Another man simply sat down and didn't move, eyes open and seeing nothing. I looked for Otto. He was not behind the wall. I had lost track of him in the first seconds of the barrage. One moment he had been beside me, the next the world had turned into noise and pressure, and I had been flat in the snow with no awareness of anything except the ground and the shells. He could have been anywhere in the square. He could have been in the group that took the worst of it. He could have been 10 meters away in the smoke, and I simply couldn't see him. I told myself these things in the order I told them. I believed the last one. The Soviet infantry came through the smoke in groups of 10 and 15, moving fast, automatic weapons firing in short bursts, sharp and immediate after the sustained roar of the barrage, each burst distinct. They came from the north and the east, converging on the open ground where the column had been caught. The men behind the wall fired back, not because anyone gave an order. The Soviet soldiers were right there, visible now as shapes moving through the smoke at 20 meters, 30 meters, and the men behind the wall had rifles and there was nothing else to do. Someone fired first, then someone else. Then it became continuous, the crack of rifles, the bark of automatic weapons, men shouting, the sound of bullets hitting stone and wood and everything else. I fired too. I aimed at the shapes in the smoke, and I pulled the trigger and the rifle kicked, and I pulled it again. Some of the shapes fell. I don't know which ones I hit. In the smoke and the fog and the noise, it was impossible to know. You fired at what was in front of you and kept firing. The fighting at the wall lasted long enough. The Soviets pushed forward, well-trained, moving in short rushes and covering each other, using the rubble the way we were using it. In some places they reached the wall, and it became close and immediate and ugly in the way that fighting becomes, when the distance is measured in arm lengths rather than meters. Then gradually the pressure in front of our position eased. Watch, the Soviets in front of us began to pull back. Not a retreat, not organized. They simply stopped advancing. The ones closest to the wall drawing back while firing, disappearing into the smoke. Someone stood up and moved forward into the gap. Not an officer. There were no officers. Just a man who moved because there was space to move into, and the alternative was to stay behind the wall while the Soviets regrouped. Others followed. I followed. We pushed through. The rubble, the craters, the dead from both sides lying together in the same snow. On the other side, more smoke, more fog, more destroyed city. But the square was behind us. I found Otto against a longer wall on the far side. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the stone, legs stretched out in front of him, eyes closed. The stillness of him, the way his head hung slightly forward, the blood that covered the left side of his face and had run down his neck and soaked into the collar of his greatcoat, freezing there in dark, stiff streaks, stopped me for a moment I will not try to describe. Then his eyes opened. They found me. They focused slowly, the way eyes focus when the brain is working to catch up with the body, and they settled on my face with an expression that was not quite relief. Otto had never been the kind of person whose emotions announce themselves, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, the particular quality of attention that a man gives to someone he had not expected to see again. He was alive. I knelt in the snow beside him. The cold went through my trousers instantly. I looked at his head. The wound was on the left side, above the ear running back toward the temple. Something had struck him there. Shrapnel or a fragment of stone from one of the detonations. The bone beneath the skin was wrong. The surface of the skull was not the shape it should have been, and the flesh around the wound had swollen and split in a way that told me the damage underneath was serious. I was not a doctor, but I had been in those tunnels long enough to learn certain things by proximity, and what I was looking at was not something that would resolve on its own. The cold had done what pressure couldn't have done quickly enough, frozen the blood where it had seeped through, slowing the bleeding to almost nothing. But the swelling was bad and getting worse. The left side of his face was already puffy and discolored, the eye on that side barely visible through the swelling. He spoke. The words came out thick, the way words come when the mechanism that produces them has been interfered with by something upstream. He said something about the left side being dark, about not being able to see properly on that side. I pulled the field dressing from my coat. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, though the cold was there, deep in the joints, but from something that had no name and that I couldn't control. The dressing trembled as I unrolled it. My fingers fumbled on the wrapping. Someone stopped beside me. I looked up. A soldier, Hungarian from the cut of his coat, the style of his helmet. He was perhaps 30, with a face I would not be able to describe in detail because I only looked at it for a moment. He looked at Otto. He looked at me. He looked at my shaking hands. He said nothing. He knelt down on the other side of Otto and reached out and held the dressing in place while I wrapped it. It took 3 minutes. The bandage was not good. Too loose on one side, too tight on the other, the blood already seeping through in 2 places before I had finished. But it was something. Better than nothing. When it was done, the Hungarian soldier stood up. He looked at Otto once more. Then he walked away into the smoke without a word, and I never saw him again. I helped Otto to his feet. He could stand. The right leg held his weight. The left knee buckled on the first attempt, and he grabbed my arm with his good hand until it steadied. His face went through something it went through quickly. Then he nodded. We moved. The column, what remained of it, had reformed somewhere ahead in northwest. And we followed the sound of it, the footsteps, the quiet movement of hundreds of men in the dark. The factory was the last building before the edge of the city, a large industrial structure, brick walls, flat roof, high windows shattered long ago. I don't know what it had produced before the war. What mattered was that it stood between us and the city's edge, and going around it meant crossing open ground where a Soviet patrol was visible to our left. Torch beams moving in the fog, perhaps 50 meters away. We went through it. Someone found a side door. We filed in single file, Otto leaning on me, the others behind. The inside was completely dark, not the partial darkness of the streets, where the fog carried some ambient glow. Total darkness, the kind where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. We moved by touch, one hand on the shoulder of the man ahead, boots testing each step before committing weight. The floor was slick with oil or frozen water. The machines stood on either side, large shapes at shoulder height, navigated by feel. Sometimes a hand brushed cold metal that burned the skin. Sometimes a boot caught on something, a loose cable, a piece of debris, and the stumble rippled back through the line. Nobody spoke, but then, near the far end, I heard it, breathing, separate from the column, from somewhere to the right, from the dark between 2 large machines, a different rhythm, slower, shallower, with a particular quality that I recognized from the tunnels. The breathing of a man who is managing pain with the only tool he has left, which is careful, not deliberate control of the one function his body will still respond to. I stopped. The man behind me walked into my back. I held up my hand in the dark. The chain behind me stopped. I turned toward the sound. I could see nothing. I moved toward it. 3 steps, 4, one hand trailing along the machine beside me. My boot found something, not debris, something that yielded slightly. I crouched, a man, lying on his side between the machines, his back against the base of one of them. I could feel the shape of him in the dark. The greatcoat, the helmet still on, the slight tremor in his body that comes from cold that has been inside you for too long. My hand found his arm. His hand found my wrist. The grip was weak but deliberate. He didn't speak. He made no sound. But he was conscious and he knew someone was there. And the grip on my wrist was not the grip of a man asking to be saved. There was no urgency in it, no desperation. It was simply contact, the specific need at the end of things to not be entirely alone in the dark. I stayed for what was probably 30 seconds, long enough for the grip to register, long enough for whatever it communicated to pass between us. His breathing continued, shallow, controlled, the breathing of a man who has found the exact minimum required and is maintaining it with great precision. Then I stood up. I turned back toward the column. I walked. Behind me in the dark between the machines, the breathing continued. I tracked it for the first 10 steps. Then the sound of the column absorbed it, and then it was gone. I have thought about those 30 seconds many times in the years since. I could not have carried him. There were no stretchers, no vehicles, no means of moving a man who could not walk through what was ahead of us. The mathematics were as clear as mathematics ever are, but mathematics are not the same as justification, and I have never confused the two. What I know is this. I left him there. I left him in the dark with his hand and his controlled breathing and whatever remained of the distance between where he was and where the breathing would eventually stop. I left him the way I would later leave Otto, not because I wanted to, but because wanting was not the operative variable. We came out the other side into open air, snow under the boots, wind in the face, real wind, the first since Castle Hill coming from the northwest, from the direction we were moving. The fog was thinner here, and the buildings of Budapest were behind us now, the last row of them, dark shapes disappearing into the murk. Ahead, open ground rising slightly, and then the dark line of the tree line where the hills began. Budapest was behind us. The hills began within 5 minutes. The ground sloped upward, gently at first, then more steeply as we moved into the wooded areas northwest of the city. Pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. The canopy closing in above, blocking whatever faint light the fog carried. The snow between the trees was deep, knee-deep in places, thigh-deep where it had drifted against the trunks. Each step was an effort. Lift, push through resistance, set down, pull the weight up after. The cold here was different from the city. In the city, the buildings had broken the wind. Here there was nothing between us and the open air. The wind came from exactly the direction we were moving toward and hit us directly, finding every gap in the greatcoat, every place where the fabric had worn thin. Within minutes, my fingers were numb, not painful, numb. The feeling simply stopped. I could see my hands, but I couldn't feel them. Otto's pace was slowing. It had been slow since the factory. In the city, the ground had been flat, and the pace was set by the column. Here on the hill, in the deep snow, his body was doing something different from what it had been doing before. The wound had not bled through the bandage again. The cold was managing that, but the swelling on the left side of his face had continued its expansion. The left eye now entirely closed, the flesh dark and taut in a way that suggested the pressure underneath was substantial. Yet he walked with his head tilted slightly right, compensating for something in his perception that the damage to the left side was producing. He didn't complain. He didn't say anything at all for the first 40 minutes of the hill. He simply moved, leaning on me when the terrain required it, moving independently when it didn't. Sometimes he stopped and the men behind him stepped around him in the narrow gaps between the trees, and then he started again. I stayed close, not because I could do anything useful. There was nothing useful to be done. I stayed because leaving him alone in the dark in these woods, with Soviet patrols moving through the trees around us, was something I wasn't prepared to do yet. The first searchlight came on at what I estimated as 10 o'clock. Far away, a kilometer perhaps more, sweeping across the hillside to the south of us. A long white beam cutting through the fog and the darkness, moving slowly left to right. Where it touched the trees, the trunks stood out sharp and clear for an instant before the beam moved on. We stopped. Everyone stopped at the same time, without command, the way a group of animals stops when one of them senses something wrong. We stood still in the trees and watched the beam sweep the hillside below us. It passed our position without pausing. We kept moving. More searchlights came on over the next hour. One swept across the ridge directly above us and we dropped flat, all of us simultaneously, pressing into the snow between the tree roots. The light passed over us. I could see it through my closed eyelids. a brightness that penetrated even the darkness behind the eyes. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it moved on. The patrols were worse than the searchlights. We heard two. The first, voices in Russian, low and conversational, a torch beam sweeping the undergrowth below us. They moved through the trees for several minutes, close enough that I could have thrown a stone and hit them, and then moved on. The second was closer, a group of perhaps 10 moving uphill on a path that crossed ours 30 meters ahead. We saw them before they saw us, dark shapes between the trunks, the occasional torch flash. We pressed against the trees behind the trunks, behind snowdrifts. The patrol crossed our path and kept going. They were searching further west. When they had gone, we waited 5 minutes before moving again. Otto stopped at the bottom of the second ridge. He sat down in the snow between two trees, his back against one trunk, and he didn't get up. I went back to him. He was conscious. His right eye was open, and it was looking at me. But the quality of it was different from before. Not the mechanical determination of a man moving, because moving is the only option. Something else. Something that had arrived at the end of a calculation and found the answer it had been avoiding. He spoke. The words came slowly. He said something about his leg, about not being able to feel it, about the cold. I looked at his left leg. The trouser was stiff with frozen moisture. When I pressed the shin, he didn't react. No flinch, no change in expression. The cold had reached the nerves, or the damage from the head wound had affected something further up the chain, or both. Either way, the leg was finished. He couldn't walk on it, not up this slope, and not through this snow. I looked at him for a long time. Behind me, the men in the group were passing, stepping around where we sat, moving uphill without stopping. Some glanced down as they went. Most didn't. They had their own arithmetic. There was no way to carry him. Not up this slope, not through this snow, not for the kilometers that remained, not for 1 kilometer. No stretcher, no vehicle, no means of moving a man who couldn't walk through knee-deep snow on a steep hillside in the dark. Not with 20 men who could barely carry themselves. I knew this. He knew this. I began to say it. I told him what I was going to do. I told him I was going to move him to where the other wounded were, the 3 men I had seen 30 meters back along the route sitting against a fallen tree. I told him I was going to leave him there. I told him there was no other option. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything. He looked at me with his one working eye and he nodded. Once, a small movement, but here is what I have carried since. He nodded before I finished the sentence. He had known since Shell Kalman, since the moment the shrapnel had opened the left side of his skull, and he had felt, in whatever way such things are felt, the quality of the damage done. He had known that the leg was coming, and that the hill was coming, and that at some point the mathematics were going to produce the answer they always produce. He had not said so. He had simply kept moving, through the square and through the factory, and through the first ridge and into the bottom of the second. Not because he believed he was going to make it, but because every meter he covered was a meter, I didn't have to stand there doing what I was now doing in a worse place. That was the gift. I didn't understand it fully until much later. On that hillside, in that moment, I understood it only enough to feel the weight of it. I put his arm over my shoulders. I half carried, half dragged him through the snow to where the 3 wounded men sat against the fallen tree. A man with 2 leg wounds whose bandages had frozen dark against the white snow. Another man with a chest wound that had gone wrong somewhere in the crossing, breathing in short, wet pulls, his face the color of old paper. I set Otto down next to them as carefully as the snow and the uneven ground permitted, which was not very carefully. When he was on the ground, I straightened up and looked at him. He looked back at me. One eye. Neither of us said anything. I turned and walked back toward the route the column had taken. I walked quickly. I did not look back, not because I didn't want to, because looking back would have made what I had just done real in a way I could not afford it to be real. Not yet. Not while I still had to move. Not while there were still hills and darkness and Soviet patrols between me and whatever came next. The snow took each footstep and held it. I kept walking. I found Ernst Vogel near the top of the second ridge. He was sitting on a flat rock at the edge of a small clearing where the trees thinned and the canopy opened enough to see the sky. Or what passed for sky that night. A deep, dark blue, the fog above us having thinned sufficiently that the stars were almost visible. Not the full stars of a clear winter night. And there was something more tentative, suggestions of stars appearing and disappearing as the remnants of cloud moved across them. But there, present, the first sky I had seen in weeks that was not the stone ceiling of a tunnel or the smoke-filled vault of a burning city. Vogel was facing east. He was looking back toward Budapest. The glow was visible from up here, not the bright ordered glow of a city at night under normal circumstances. The warm distributed light of a million windows, of streets and shops and the ordinary illumination of people living their lives. This was something else entirely, a dull orange-red light on the horizon, unsteady, pulsing with the flashes of artillery and the fires that had been burning for weeks. It throbbed. It breathed almost. And in the irregular rhythm of sustained destruction, brighter for a moment when something large went up, then subsiding, then brightening again. The whole eastern horizon reduced to that single color, the color of things ending. Budapest, the place where we had spent the last 50 days dying by degrees. Now it was just a glow, growing smaller with each step we took away from it. I sat down on the rock beside him. The stone was cold through my trousers. The wind up here was stronger than in the trees below. The ridge offered no shelter from it, channeling it instead, so that it hit directly and continuously. But I sat down anyway because my legs needed to stop moving, even briefly, even if briefly was all there was. Neither of us spoke. We sat and looked at the glow on the horizon, in the darkness ahead, and the almost stars above us. To below in the trees on the slope behind us, the sounds of the column continued. The quiet, persistent shuffle of boots on snow, the occasional low sound of a man stumbling and catching himself, the breathing of hundreds of people moving through the dark. The column was smaller than it had been, much smaller. I thought about Otto. I thought about the man in the factory, the breathing in the dark between the machines, the hand on my wrist that had asked for nothing except 30 seconds of presence and had received exactly that and nothing more. I wondered whether his breathing had stopped yet, whether someone else had found him, or whether the dark between those machines was where it ended. I thought about the sack of 8 pistols on the tunnel floor, and the 600 people I had left behind in the hill, and the woman with the child whose crying had run out of sound, and the man pushing the baby carriage on the ice. I thought about Dr. Brandt moving through the wards with his reused bandages and his generator that was running out of fuel, and his certainty, visible in everything he did, in the economy of his movements and the flatness of his voice, that the situation was what it was, and the only available response was to continue operating within it for as long as operating was possible. I thought about what Brandt had said about Baton. Generals who give orders to hold at all costs are almost never the ones paying the cost. It was true of Baton. It was true of this hill. It was true, I suspected, of most hills, in most wars. When across most of the centuries that hills had been fought over by men who were not the ones who had decided they needed to be fought over. I don't know how long we sat there before Vogel spoke. It was quiet when it came, barely louder than the wind, not directed at me specifically, not a statement shaped for an audience, not an observation offered for response. It came out the way things come out when a man has been holding them inside for a long time, and the container has finally reached its limit. He said, Budapest was worse than Stalingrad. He did not say it with emphasis. He did not say it with the particular weight of a man making a dramatic declaration. He said it the way you state something you have known for a long time and have been arguing with yourself about, and have finally stopped arguing with. Flat, plain. When the way a man states the temperature of a room or the distance to a town. I did not reply immediately. He had been in both places. He had gone into the Stalingrad pocket in November of 1942 with the 6th Army and had come out of it alive in February of 1943, one of a few hundred who walked out before the final surrender. He had lived through what that city became in those months, the factory districts and the grain elevator and the Volga at his back, and the temperature and the dying by degrees and the specific knowledge acquired over weeks that the army he was part of had been expendable, that the decision to hold at all costs had been made by men who would pay none of those costs. He had been through all of that, And now he was sitting on a rock outside Budapest saying this had been worse, not as a comparison between horrors, and not as arithmetic about relative suffering, which is always the wrong arithmetic. He was saying something more specific. At Stalingrad, he had told me once in the tunnels, there had at least been a framework. The ideological architecture of the thing, however false, had still been intact. The belief, or the performance of belief, or the inability to distinguish between the two, that what was being held was worth holding, that the cost meant something. In Budapest, by February of 1945, there was no architecture left. Everyone in those tunnels knew the war was over. Everyone knew what the 3 failed relief operations meant, and what the silence of the radio meant, and what the faces of the officers meant when they came back from the surface positions. And there was no framework remaining into which the dying could be inserted and made to mean something. There was only the dying, and the order to continue, and the distance between those two things, which was the same distance as the distance between the men giving the order and the men carrying it out. That was what was worse. Not the cold, not the wounds, the absence of meaning, the specific desolation of being asked to pay a cost that the people setting the price had already decided didn't matter. Every man who had come back from a war and sat in his kitchen trying to explain something that the people across the table had no framework for receiving. Every man who had carried that question for years afterward, the question that has no answer that satisfies, understood what Vogel meant without needing it explained. And the question is always the same. What was it for? And the answer, when you strip away everything else, is usually some version of, it was for the men next to you, for nothing else, and the men next to you are gone. Vogel was not talking about a comparison between two battles. He was talking about what it costs a man to discover that the thing he was asked to believe in was not real, and that the discovery came too late to change what he had already done and lost inside the believing. I understood this. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have been equal to what he had said, and he had not said it to receive a reply. He had said it because it was true, and he had finally run out of the energy required to keep it inside. We sat a while longer. Then Vogel stood. He stood the way he did everything, without announcement, and without the preparatory adjustments of a tired man gathering himself. He simply stood, as though the decision and the execution were a single event. He looked east one more time, then he turned northwest, toward the dark and the hills, and whatever remained of the distance between us and the German lines. I stood. We moved back into the trees. The sky was changing. Not bright, not yet, not for another hour at least. But the deep, absolute black of full night was fading at its eastern edges, the horizon behind us shifting from black to the darkest possible blue, a color that existed at the boundary between night and the promise of morning. Dawn was coming, slowly, imperceptibly, the way all permanent things change. Not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments that you only recognize when enough of them have passed. When everyone in the column knew what it meant. In daylight, on open ground, we were targets. The searchlights had been bad enough. Soviet aircraft in daylight would be something else entirely. The race for the past several hours had not been against the patrols or the artillery or the cold. It had been against the sun, and the sun was winning. We moved faster. The trees thinned as we climbed higher onto the ridge. The ground became rockier, the snow shallower but harder. A thin crust over frozen earth that cracked under the boots with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. The wind was stronger up here, colder, finding every place where the greatcoat had worn thin and entering there, directly, without ceremony. My group was smaller now, 20 men, perhaps fewer. Behind us, somewhere in the hills, when other groups were moving in the same direction, or not moving, or moving in the wrong direction, or lying in the snow, where they had finally stopped and couldn't get up again. I didn't know. I could only see the man in front of me in the trees and the snow in the sky that was slowly, with great patience, beginning to fill with a light that none of us wanted. The man directly in front of me was perhaps 50 years old, with the thick build of someone who had spent his working life doing physical labor. He had been moving with a slight drag on his left leg for the last hour, each step requiring a visible effort of will to complete. He had not fallen, Well, he kept moving with a stubborn, mechanical persistence that had nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with the refusal to stop while stopping was still a choice rather than a condition. I watched him move. I thought, this is what it looks like. Not heroism, nothing so shaped and purposeful as that. Simply the refusal to become a statistic before the statistic is unavoidable. The insistence on being a man who is still walking for as long as walking is physically possible. One foot, then the other, the snow resisting, the wind taking everything that wasn't anchored, the leg dragging and still forward. Vogel was somewhere ahead. I had lost sight of him when we re-entered the trees, the fog and the dark absorbing him within a minute of movement. But I knew he was ahead. There was something about Vogel that made it inconceivable he was anywhere else. He was the man who had walked out of Stalingrad. He would walk out of this too, or he would be the last one moving, which is a different kind of walking out. Another ridge, another descent into a narrow valley where the trees crowded close, and the snow was deep between them, and the silence was the silence of a place that had no awareness of what was moving through it. Then another climb. The hills kept going the way hills keep going, indifferently at their own scale, with no interest in the human drama being enacted across their surface. At the top of the third ridge, I stopped and looked back. The glow of Budapest was still visible on the eastern horizon, smaller now, or seeming smaller. It was difficult to know whether the city's burning had actually diminished or whether the distance was simply providing perspective. Either way, it was behind me, receding, becoming the kind of thing that is real and enormous when you are inside it, and then becomes a point of light on a horizon, and then becomes a memory, and then becomes, eventually, something that happened to a person you used to be. I did not know then how long that process takes. I know now that it doesn't complete, that the point of light stays on the horizon regardless of how far you walk from it, that the glow of the things you left behind, the people, the decisions, the specific texture of the moments you cannot recover, continues to pulse at the edge of your vision for the rest of your life. Dimmer with time, yes, but never gone. I turned back to the northwest and kept moving. The trees ended. We came out of the forest onto an open slope, a long hillside covered in unbroken snow, the surface smooth and blue-white in the growing pre-dawn light, rising toward a crest perhaps 300 meters above us. No cover, completely exposed, the kind of terrain that, an hour ago in full darkness, we could have crossed without difficulty. In the growing light, we were visible for kilometers. The group stopped at the tree line. 20 men standing at the edge of the forest, looking at the open slope, calculating the same calculation simultaneously. The crest was 300 meters. At the pace we had been moving, exhausted men in deep snow, perhaps 6 minutes of exposure. 6 minutes in which any Soviet patrol within sight, any aircraft, any observer with field glasses would have a clear view of 20 men in gray greatcoats moving across a white hillside. 6 minutes. Vogel appeared from somewhere to my left. He had been there ahead of us, already at the tree line, already looking at the slope. He looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he said, "Move fast and don't stop." That was all. He stepped out of the trees and started up the slope. We followed. The snow on the open hillside was wind-compacted, denser, forming a surface that was mostly solid, but that gave way without warning into deeper pockets beneath. You couldn't establish a rhythm. Each step had to be tested. But testing each step cost time, and time was the thing we didn't have. So you committed and trusted, and when the surface gave way, you caught yourself and committed again. I ran where I could. Walked fast where running wasn't possible. My lungs were burning. The cold air and the weeks of inadequate food and the hours of movement had reduced my reserves to something I could feel the edges of with each deep breath. The muscles in my legs were operating on something beyond ordinary fatigue, something that had moved past the category of tired into a different category I didn't have a word for. They worked because I required them to work. That was the entirety of the arrangement. 100 meters up the slope, I heard it, the distant sound of an aircraft engine. From the south, not directly overhead, not close, but in the pre-dawn stillness, the sound carried with terrible clarity. I didn't look up. Looking up cost time and altered nothing. I kept moving. The sound grew for 30 seconds, then faded. Either the aircraft was moving away from us, or we were too small a group on too large a hillside to attract attention. It didn't matter. I moved. 200 meters. The crest was close now. The men around me were spread across the hillside in a loose formation that had no military coherence. Just individuals moving at the speed their bodies allowed, each one alone in the effort of it, connected to the others only by the shared direction of movement. At 250 meters, the man with the dragging left leg fell. He went down suddenly without the preliminary stumble that usually precedes a fall. One step and then simply down, his body making the decision that his will had been overriding for the past hour. He fell forward into the snow and lay still for a moment. Then slowly he began to get up. I was several meters past him when I heard it. I stopped. I turned back. He was on his hands and knees in the snow, the left leg extended behind him, trying to get the right leg under him to push upright. His face, when I reached him, was the face of a man engaged in a private argument with his own body that he was determined to win. I got him under the left arm and pulled. He came up. His right leg found the ground. His left leg followed, dragging but present. He nodded once, the universal gesture of men in that situation acknowledging help without conceding need, and started moving again. I moved with him. The crest was 50 meters, then 30, then 10, and then we were over it, the slope dropping away in front of us into another valley, and we were on the far side. And behind us, the open hillside was empty, and the aircraft sound was gone, and the pre-dawn light was still manageable, still not the full exposure of morning. We stopped at the crest, all of us, the 20 men, some bent over, some standing with their hands on their knees, all of them breathing hard in visible clouds that the wind immediately took. Nobody spoke. Vogel stood at the far edge of the group, looking down into the valley below. After a moment, he turned back to us. He said, "German lines are in the valley, maybe 2 kilometers. Nobody reacted visibly. The information arrived and was absorbed into the same steady state that everything had been absorbed into for the past several hours. Without celebration, without disbelief, simply received and filed. 2 more kilometers. Then whatever came after that. We started down the slope. The valley was narrow, with a frozen stream running along its center and stands of birch trees on either bank, their white trunks standing out against the snow, with a clarity that seemed strange after hours of fog and murk. The fog had thinned substantially as we descended, patches remaining in the hollows, but the air between clearer than anything I had breathed since the tunnels. We moved along the stream. The ice was solid enough to walk on in places, and we used it where we could. The surface smoother than the snow-covered banks, the footing more reliable. The birch trees stood on either side like a corridor. I thought about Marta. The letter was still in my coat pocket. I had written it in the tunnels 3 days before the breakout, walking the hour between the end of the evening round and the dimming of the lights. I had written it by the light of one of the small lamps, sitting on the floor with my back against the tunnel wall, the paper on my knee. I had used the voice I used when I wrote to her in ordinary times. Not the voice of a soldier in a siege, not the careful neutral language I had been using in letters since the beginning, calibrated to pass through censors and to avoid causing specific fears. My own voice, the voice of a man who taught children mathematics on Lindenstrasse, and who had a wife who left books open face down on every surface, and whose coffee was always too strong, and who was, in the precise and untheoretical sense of the word, loved. I had written it as a letter of the kind you write when you don't know whether the person you are writing to will ever read it. Not a farewell. I had resisted the shape of farewell, the way it organizes itself into finality, a continuation, as though the letter were part of a conversation that was going to keep going, that would find its way back to its ordinary register of the things we talked about. Her sister's difficult husband, the books, the coffee, what Leipzig looked like in spring when the linden trees came into flower on Lindenstrasse, the particular quality of light in our apartment on Sunday mornings. I had not written about the tunnels. I had not written about the pistols, or Otto, or the 600. I had not written about what was coming, because what was coming was not the kind of thing that belonged in that letter. I had folded it and put it in my coat pocket and I had not sent it because there was no mechanism for sending it. And now it was in my pocket on this hillside and would stay there until I found a mechanism or until the mechanism became unnecessary. The German lines were not announced. There was no clear boundary, no marked perimeter, no sign that said, here is where one territory ends and something else begins. What there was, around a bend in the frozen stream, was a voice, in German, calling out a challenge in the flat official tone of a sentry who has been instructed to challenge and is doing so without particular expectation of a response. Vogel answered. The sentry, young, I could see his face when we reached him. Younger than anyone had a right to be standing in that valley at that hour. Looked at us. He looked at the 20 of us. He looked at Vogel specifically, at the rank insignia, at whatever else he read in the face of a man who had come over that ridge in the pre-dawn light with 19 others, and the specific expression of a man who has completed something he is not going to explain. The sentry stepped aside. We passed through. There was a command post in a farmhouse 200 meters inside the line. A low stone building with a generator running and actual electric light visible through the windows. Warm yellow light that was so different from the lamplight of the tunnels that it stopped several of the men in their tracks when they saw it, as though the specific quality of it required a moment to process. Inside, a table, maps, a radio that was functioning, and us two officers who looked at the group that filed through the door with an expression that contained several things at once. Relief, computation, something that was almost pity, but that stopped short of pity because pity required an acknowledgement that there was something to be pitied, and the men in that room were not ready to make that acknowledgement yet. Hot liquid was produced, some form of ersatz coffee, thin and barely warm by the time it reached me, but containing heat, actual heat, the physical fact of warmth that had not come from another person's body. I held the cup in both hands and felt the heat move through the palms, into the fingers, and up into the wrists, slowly, in the incremental way that warmth moves into extremities that have been cold for a long time. Vogel was at the table with the officers immediately. Maps. A conversation in low, urgent voices. He had not sat down. He stood at the table in his greatcoat with the snow still drying on the shoulders and looked at the maps with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Total, unhurried, as though the situation was simply information to be assessed and responded to, regardless of what it had cost to arrive at the table to assess it. I sat on the floor with my back against the stone wall. The warmth of the building arrived slowly, the way it does when the cold has been thorough. Not as comfort, but as sensation returning to places that had gone beyond sensation into numbness. The fingertips first, a deep ache as the circulation returned. Then the face. Then the feet, which were the worst. The specific burning pain of feet that had been frozen for hours beginning to register what they had been through. I sat with the cup in my hands and I looked at the other men in the room. 18 of us had made it over that last ridge. 18 out of the group of 20 that had come off the second ridge after leaving Otto. I didn't know the names of most of them. We had moved through the night together in the specific proximity of people who share a direction and a danger without sharing anything else. Without history, without conversation, without the ordinary apparatus of human connection. We had been, for those hours, simply bodies moving in the same direction through the dark. Now in the light, they were faces. The man with the dragging left leg sat against the opposite wall, with his leg extended and his eyes closed, and an expression of pure physical relief so complete it looked like something else. The man who had lost sensation in his arm during the barrage was having it examined by someone with a medical kit. The others sat or stood in various attitudes of exhaustion, each one conducting whatever private inventory of damage and survival their body required. The number reached me through the officers at the table. I heard it before I fully understood it. One of the officers saying it to Vogel, a report coming in on the radio, numbers being compiled, the mathematics of the night being assembled into a figure. Vogel receiving it with the expression he received everything with, which was no expression at all. The number was 785. Of the 17,000 German soldiers who had left Budapest the previous night, 17,000 men who had filed out of the tunnels and the positions and the cellars and the ruined buildings, who had crossed Vermazo in groups of 50, who had moved through the silent streets toward the hills, who had been in the square when the three flares went up. Of those, 17,785 had reached the German lines. Less than 5%. I sat with the cup in my hands and held the number in my mind the way you hold something very cold, carefully aware of what it is doing to the surface it touches. Less than 5%. The barrage at Shell Kalman had taken some of them. The cold had taken others. The patrols in the hills. The Soviet infantry pushing through the fog. The men who had sat down in the snow because the leg wouldn't work anymore, or the head wound had taken the balance, and there was nothing left to manage with. The men in the factories and the cellars who had never made it out of the city at all. The ones who had been in the square when the rockets came in salvos and had simply stopped. 15,215 men. That was the remainder. That was what 17,000 minus 785 produced when you did the arithmetic that I, as a former mathematics teacher from Leipzig, was entirely capable of doing and had been declining to do for the past several hours. I thought about what Vogel had said on the rock. Budapest was worse than Stalingrad, not because of the cold or the wounds or the duration or the specific texture of the dying, because of the absence of the framework. Because every one of those 15,000 men had died, was dying still, many of them, in the snow on the hillsides outside Budapest, in the Soviet encirclement, in the conditions that came after capture, for a Festung that had not been a fortress, for an order that had been given by men who had already calculated that the garrison was expendable, that Budapest's fall was a matter of time, and that the time could be bought with other men's lives without any meaningful effect on the outcome. I thought about Otto, sitting against a fallen tree in the snow on the hillside with three other men who couldn't move. I thought about whether the cold had reached him yet, or whether someone had come through those trees after us. I thought about his hand releasing the pistol without resistance on the 14th night, the hand simply opening, as though he had been waiting for someone to come and take it. I thought about the man in the factory, whether his breathing had stopped yet, whether anyone would find him before it did, or whether the dark between those machines was where it ended, quietly, with no one there to mark it. I reached into my coat pocket. The letter was there, folded twice, the paper slightly damp from hours inside the coat, but intact. I took it out and looked at it. The fold had held. Marta's name was on the outside in my own handwriting, which looked strange to me in the morning light. The handwriting of a person I had been some months ago, in a room on Lindenstrasse, in a life that had the texture of something that had happened to someone else. I had not sent it because there had been no mechanism for sending it. I put it back in my pocket. There would be a mechanism. Eventually, when the machinery of the war reorganized itself into something capable of carrying letters, there would be a way to send it. And if there wasn't, if the mechanisms failed, if the distance couldn't be crossed, then it would stay in the pocket. And either way, the words in it were already said, already complete. A man who taught mathematics on Lindenstrasse, telling his wife about spring light and linden trees and coffee, and the specific quality of Sunday mornings in a room that was still, in some sense, that geography and war and the distance of months could not fully reach theirs. Vogel appeared in the doorway of the farmhouse. He stood there for a moment, looking at the valley and the birch trees and the morning light. He had the map in his hand. He was already preparing for whatever came next. He did not look back toward the hills. He had looked back from the rock the night before, had looked at the glow of Budapest for a long time, and had said what he needed to say about it. The looking was done. He caught my eye. He said, "We move in 20 minutes." I nodded. He went back inside. I stood a while longer with the cup in my hands and the letter in my pocket and the number in my head. 785. Less than 5%. The mathematics of a night that had cost what it cost and produced what it produced, and was now, in the specific sense of being over, finished. Outside the farmhouse, the dawn was arriving. Full light now. The sun below the horizon, but close enough that the snow on the hillsides had color. Blue-white in the shadows. A faint gold where the first light touched the upper slopes. The birch trees in the valley stood in their own stillness. The frost on their branches catching the light in the way frost catches light, which is quietly and without announcement, simply by being present when the light arrives. I drank what remained in the cup. I went inside. In 20 minutes, we moved. Of the 70,000 Axis soldiers and hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in Budapest when the Soviet ring closed on December 26, 1944, the siege ended on February 13, 1945, 2 days after the breakout. Of the approximately 17,000 German soldiers who attempted to break out on the night of February 11, 785 reached German lines. Karl Brenner was one of them. He never sent the letter.